The drive to Catherine's house was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Julian Thorne, a man who commanded boardrooms and reshaped skylines, felt like an intruder in his own past. The 2 years since the divorce, filled with punishing work hours and intercontinental flights, had served their purpose. They had numbed him, turning memory into a series of detached observations. He had convinced himself it was a strategic retreat, a necessary sacrifice to build an empire that would, one day, provide his daughter with anything she could ever desire. Now, pulling his silent, slate-gray sedan through the gilded gates of the Greenwich estate he had given Catherine, he acknowledged the hollowness of that logic. An empire was cold comfort for a father who had become a stranger. The house stood as it always had, a monument of limestone and glass, perfectly manicured and utterly soulless. It wasn't a home. It was a statement of wealth, a fortress of impeccable taste. He remembered a time, briefly, when he tried to fill it with warmth, with the chaotic joy of a new family. But the house had resisted, its sterile surfaces reflecting only a cold, architectural perfection that seemed to be Catherine's native element. He saw his daughter, Lily, standing on the perfectly swept flagstone porch, a small, still figure in a pristine white dress. But it was the way she stood, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, that sent the first sharp splinter of unease through the carefully constructed armor around his heart. She looked like a tiny porcelain doll arranged for display, not a 6-year-old girl waiting for her father. Catherine emerged from the heavy oak door, a vision of casual elegance in cream-colored cashmere. Her smile was the same as it had always been, a masterpiece of cosmetic dentistry and social calculation. It never reached her eyes. "Julian, you're punctual. As always." "Catherine," he said, his voice flat. He stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under his expensive shoes, and his gaze went straight back to Lily. "Hello, sweetheart." Lily didn't run to him. She didn't even move. She just watched him with enormous, solemn gray eyes. His eyes, he realized with a pang of guilt. He crouched down to her level, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "I missed you, Lilypad." It was his old name for her, from a time of bedtime stories and piggyback rides. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. That was when he saw her hands. He had expected her to bring them forward for a hug, but they remained hidden. Gently, he reached for her. "Can I have a hug?" She flinched, a small, bird-like movement, before allowing him to draw her into a stiff embrace. As his arms wrapped around her, he felt her hands press against his back, and a cold dread washed over him. He pulled back slightly, his manufactured smile dissolving. "Lily, let me see your hands." She tried to pull them away, her lower lip trembling, but he was faster, his grip gentle but firm. He turned her small hands over in his own. They were raw. The skin on her palms and between her fingers was an angry, inflamed red, cracked and peeling in places, as if they'd been scoured with something harsh, something abrasive. It wasn't the soft, pink skin of a child. It looked tortured. "What is this?" he asked, his voice a low growl, looking up at Catherine, whose perfect smile had tightened by a fraction of a millimeter. "Oh, that," she said, waving a dismissive, manicured hand. "It's just a terrible bout of eczema. The dermatologist says it's a nervous habit, all that hand-washing. You know how sensitive she is." The lie was smooth, practiced, and for a horrifying second, Julian almost believed it. But then he looked back down at his daughter's eyes, and in their silent, frightened depths, he saw the truth. This was not eczema. This was not a nervous habit. This was a secret, spoken in the brutal language of damaged skin. A deeper, more unsettling question began to form in his mind, a question that would consume him for the days to come. He'd come back to reconnect with his daughter, but he was beginning to realize he was here for a different reason entirely. He was here for a rescue mission. The house no longer felt just cold. It felt dangerous. Its pristine surfaces seemed to mock him, hiding a darkness he was only just beginning to perceive. The unsettling sensory details of the place began to assault him. The chemical tang of polish hanging in the air, so strong it overshadowed the scent of the prize-winning roses in the garden. The profound, unnatural silence, unbroken by the sound of television, or music, or the simple, chaotic noise of a child at play. It was the silence of a gallery, of a tomb, where every object was in its place and every person was an exhibit. His memory, a sharp and painful counterpoint, supplied the image of the small, messy apartment they'd shared before his first big success. The smell of crayons and burnt toast, the sound of Lily's gleeful shrieks as she finger-painted on newspapers spread across the floor. This sterile mansion wasn't just a different location. It was a different reality, and he felt a primal fear that his daughter was being systematically erased within its walls. The dinner was a masterclass in controlled tension. The long mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the cold light of the crystal chandelier above. Each place setting was a geometric certainty of silver and porcelain. Julian sat opposite Catherine, with Lily between them at the side, a small, silent observer at a peace negotiation where only one side was armed. Catherine orchestrated the meal with the effortless precision of a conductor, directing the silent, white-gloved staff with minute gestures. The food was exquisite, of course. Seared scallops with a saffron risotto. But the taste was lost on Julian. His senses were entirely focused on the tiny drama unfolding beside him. Lily ate with a painstaking, fearful neatness that was utterly alien to a 6-year-old. She cut her single scallop into impossibly small pieces, lifting each one to her mouth with the concentration of a bomb disposal expert. Her movements were stiff, her back ramrod straight. Julian watched her hands, those poor red hands, as they gripped the child-sized silverware. They trembled slightly. "So," Catherine began, her voice smooth as silk, cutting through the oppressive quiet. "Tell me about the Hong Kong expansion. The financial papers are calling you a titan. You must be pleased it was a probe, a way of reminding him of the world he'd chosen over this one." "It's progressing," Julian said, his eyes not leaving Lily. He tried to engage her directly, his voice gentle. "Did you do any painting at school today, Lilypad?" Lily froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. She glanced at her mother, a quick, terrified flicker of her eyes. "We're focusing more on penmanship now," Catherine answered for her, taking a delicate sip of wine. "Painting is so messy. Lily understands the importance of cleanliness. Don't you, darling?" The word messy hung in the air like a toxin. Lily gave another of her tiny, haunted nods and placed her fork down with a soft click. A single green pea rolled from her plate onto the pristine white tablecloth. It was a minuscule infraction, a moment that would pass unnoticed in any normal home. Here it was a gunshot. Lily gasped, a sharp intake of breath, and her entire body went rigid. She stared at the pea as if it were a scorpion. Her gaze shot to her mother, her face pale with terror. She instinctively tried to hide her hands under the table. Catherine's smile didn't falter, but her eyes turned to chips of ice. She placed her wine glass down with chilling deliberation. "Oh, dear," she said, her voice dropping to a soft, dangerous purr. "What have we done?" Julian felt a surge of cold fury. He wanted to leap across the table, to shatter the perfect facade. But he knew, with the cold calculation that had made him his fortune, that it would be a catastrophic mistake. He was on enemy territory. He needed intel. He needed a strategy. Instead, he reached out and casually picked up the pea, placing it on the side of his own plate. "No harm done," he said, his voice level. His eyes locked on Catherine's in a silent declaration of war. "Just a little mess." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, maybe even rage, before she masked it again. She signaled a maid, who appeared instantly to whisk away the offending tablecloth as if it were biohazardous waste. Later that night, unable to sleep in the sterile guest suite, Julian's mind replayed the scene, each detail sharpening the edges of his dread. The image of Lily's terror over a single pea was more damning than any bruise. He closed his eyes and forced himself to remember. A different kitchen, a different life. He saw Lily, 3 years old, her face and hands and hair smeared with every color of the rainbow. They were finger-painting, a glorious, unrestrained riot of it, on a huge sheet of butcher paper spread on the floor of their old, cramped apartment. He had been as covered in paint as she was, and they were both laughing, a full-bodied, uninhibited joy that had felt like the most valuable thing in the world. He remembered dabbing a spot of blue on her nose, and her squeal of delight as she retaliated by planting a bright yellow handprint on his cheek. The memory was so vivid, so warm, that it made the present reality feel like a physical blow. He had traded that laughter for stock portfolios and market shares. He had left that vibrant, messy, joyful child in the care of a woman who saw a single pea as a declaration of war on her perfect order. The contrast was a blade twisting in his gut, and with it came a terrible, galvanizing clarity. He had failed her once by leaving. He would not fail her again. The next morning, Julian announced he needed to take a walk to clear his head, a plausible excuse for a man supposedly still wrestling with jet lag. Catherine, busy directing a landscaping crew to correct a barely perceptible asymmetry in a row of boxwoods, agreed with an indifferent wave. The crisp autumn air did nothing to cool the simmering rage inside him. His path was deliberate. He headed for the edge of the property, where a low stone wall separated Catherine's manicured perfection from the slightly wilder, more comfortable yard of the neighboring house. He'd seen an elderly woman working in her garden there yesterday. Mrs. Gable, he recalled her name. He found her again, kneeling by a bed of late-blooming roses, a sturdy trowel in her gloved hand. She looked up as he approached, her eyes, framed by a web of fine lines, were wary but intelligent. "Morning," Julian said, leaning against the stone wall. "Beautiful roses. They do their best," she said, her voice raspy but kind. She studied him for a moment. "You're Mr. Thorne, Lily's father." "Julian, please. I'm just visiting for a few days." He kept his tone casual, friendly. "It's a quiet neighborhood." "It is," she agreed, turning back to her roses, snipping a dead bloom. "Sometimes too quiet." It was the opening he needed. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Gable sighed, a heavy, weary sound. She hesitated, glancing toward Catherine's house as if its windows were eyes. "It's not my place," she began, her voice dropping lower. "But a house with a little girl. You expect to hear things. Laughter, shouting, the sound of a ball bouncing. There's none of that." Never. She paused, her gaze becoming more direct, searching his face. "I'm an old woman. I don't sleep through the night like I used to. Sometimes late I hear sounds from over there. Not crying. Something else." "What kind of sounds?" Julian asked, his heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. She looked down at her trowel, scraping a bit of dirt from its edge. "Scrubbing," she whispered, the word barely audible over the rustle of the leaves. A harsh, frantic sound, like someone trying to scour a stain out of a stone floor. It goes on for a long time. The image it conjured of Lily, of her red, raw hands, was so sickening that Julian had to physically brace himself against the wall. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice tight. "Thank you for telling me." She simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He was not alone in his suspicion. He had a witness, however reluctant. Armed with this grim validation, he returned to the house. Catherine was gone, off to a charity luncheon. The staff moved like ghosts. This was his chance. He went straight to Lily's room. It was as immaculate as the rest of the house, a showroom for a child's bedroom rather than a place of play. The toys on the shelves were perfectly aligned, dusty with disuse. He searched methodically, his hands feeling alien against the pristine surfaces. He looked under the bed, in the closet, behind the perfectly arranged dolls. Finally, he lifted her pillow. Tucked between the pillowcase and the pillow itself was a folded piece of drawing paper. He carefully opened it. The drawing was simple, rendered in the shaky, earnest lines of a 6-year-old. It depicted two figures. One was tall and slender, with a wide, bright, perfectly rendered smile and a dress made of sharp, angry black scribbles. She held the hand of the second figure, a small, stick-like child. The child had no mouth. and its hands, at the end of its stick-like arms, were colored in with a furious, overlapping scrawl of red crayon, so thick the paper had nearly torn. The small figure was standing in a field of what looked like wilted, broken flowers. It was a confession, a silent scream. Julian folded the paper with reverent care and slipped it into his pocket. It was the first piece of hard evidence, more damning than any testimony. He wasn't just investigating a suspicion anymore. He was building a case. The drawing was a map, but he needed the weapon. The next day, Julian knew he had to get into Catherine's private spaces. The opportunity came in the mid-afternoon, during the house's designated quiet time. Another of Catherine's rigid, suffocating rules. He feigned a sudden, urgent business call from his European office, a manufactured crisis that demanded privacy and a strong signal. He paced the downstairs hall, phone to his ear, pretending to argue about fluctuating market futures. "The connection is terrible down here," he announced to a passing maid. "I need to go upstairs. Is Catherine's office available?" The reception is usually better at that end of the house. It was a gamble, but the staff's first loyalty was to the master of the house, and in their eyes, he still held that title. The maid nodded timidly and scurried away. He strode into Catherine's home office. It was as sterile and impersonal as a surgeon's theater. White lacquer, chrome, glass. Not a single photograph, not a personal trinket. It spoke of a woman who curated her life, rather than lived it. While his muted phone played a pre-recorded conference call into his earbud, he began his search. His eyes scanned the room, his mind working with the cold, detached logic he usually reserved for hostile takeovers. He tried the drawers of her desk. Locked. He examined a sleek, minimalist credenza against the wall. Also locked. He remembered seeing a single, ornate silver key on the ring with her car keys. That had to be it. Direct access was impossible. He needed to find what she hadn't bothered to lock away, what she thought was safely hidden in plain sight. He abandoned the office and moved down the hall to the master suite. The bedroom was a sea of white and gray, as welcoming as a hotel room. He ignored it, heading straight for the ensuite bathroom. This was a temple of vanity. Rows of expensive creams and perfumes were arranged on marble countertops with geometric precision. It felt wrong, a deep violation of privacy. But the image of Lily's raw hands burned in his mind, extinguishing any sense of guilt. He opened the mirrored cabinets. More cosmetics, prescription bottles, everything neatly labeled. Nothing. He crouched down, his knees protesting, and opened the large cabinet under the sink. At first, all he saw were luxury bath oils and imported soaps, a wall of extravagant self-care. But his instincts, honed by years of seeing past corporate window dressing, told him to look deeper. He reached in, pushing aside bottles of lavender and bergamot. His fingers brushed against something hard and rough. He pulled it out. It was a scrubbing brush. Not a soft-bristled body brush, but a stiff, vicious-looking thing with coarse, industrial-grade bristles, the kind used for scouring grout from tile floors. His blood ran cold. He reached back in. There were two more, along with a large, unlabeled bar of grayish soap. He lifted the soap to his nose. It had a sharp, caustic smell, like lye. It was a brutal, primitive cleaning agent, designed to strip away grime, to bleach and purify. He stood up, the brush heavy in his hand, a medieval instrument of torture disguised as a household tool. The connection was instantaneous and sickening. The scrubbing sounds Mrs. Gable heard in the night. Lily's hands, cracked and bleeding, scoured raw not by a nervous habit, but by this, by her own mother. He understood now the particular, twisted cruelty of it. Catherine wasn't just punishing her daughter for being a child, for making a mess. She was trying to scrub the perceived imperfection out of her, to cleanse her of any trace of the chaotic, emotional, messy humanity she inherited from her father. He looked at his own reflection in the vast mirror, a stranger in a suit, holding the instrument of his daughter's torment. For a long, terrifying moment, an almost uncontrollable wave of violent rage washed over him. He wanted to smash the mirror, to tear the room apart, to find Catherine and confront her with the brutal evidence in his hand. But he fought it back, forcing the fury down, compressing it into a cold, diamond-hard core of purpose. A public explosion would only give her the upper hand. She would paint him as unstable, an angry ex-husband. He needed more. He needed to dismantle her world with the same surgical precision she used to torture their child. Carefully, he placed the brush and soap back exactly where he had found them, wiping his fingerprints from the bottles he had moved. He closed the cabinet door. He walked out of the bathroom, his face a mask of calm, the soldier returning to his position after confirming the enemy's artillery placement. The war had just become terrifyingly real. Operating within the cold, silent walls of the house felt like being deep behind enemy lines. Every word was a potential misstep, every glance a risk. Julian's first move was to retreat to the guest house, citing his disruptive work calls as the reason. From there, he made the most important call of his life. He didn't call his lawyer. He called Marcus Vance, the man who ran his global security operations. Marcus, a quiet, unassuming man who had spent 2 decades in signals intelligence, was ferociously loyal and brutally efficient. "Marcus," Julian said, his voice low, "I need a full-spectrum analysis. My ex-wife, Catherine Devereaux Thorne. I want everything from the last 5 years. Financials, social circles, travel, communications. But I also need you to go deeper. I want her history, sealed records, juvenile files, anything that has been buried. Spare no expense. And Marcus, be invisible." "Understood, Julian," was the only reply. The line went dead. Now came the hardest part, waiting. Patience was a virtue Julian had cultivated in the boardroom, but this was different. This was a test of his soul. He had to continue the charade, to sit across from a monster at breakfast and discuss the weather. The next day, Catherine announced they were having a family outing. Her choice was a modern art museum, a place of stark white walls and challenging, intellectual installations. It was her territory, clean, controlled, and emotionally sterile. Julian agreed, knowing a refusal would raise suspicion. The museum was a fresh circle of hell. He watched Catherine glide through the galleries, offering performative critiques of the art to another society wife they encountered. She was in her element, playing the role of the cultured, intelligent matriarch. Lily, dressed in another immaculate, uncomfortable-looking outfit, said nothing. She didn't look at the art. She stayed close to Julian, her small hand occasionally gripping the fabric of his trousers. He was her only anchor in this cold, white sea. He tried to engage her, pointing to a vibrant, chaotic sculpture made of found objects. "Look at that, lily pad. It's like the biggest, messiest toy box in the world." Lily glanced at it, then quickly looked away, a flicker of fear in her eyes, as if even looking at something so messy was a transgression. He felt a profound, protective ache in his chest. This small, silent person was relying on him, and he was forced to play a waiting game while her torment continued. He had to create small moments of safety for her. In a secluded sculpture garden, while Catherine was momentarily distracted by an acquaintance, Julian knelt beside Lily. They were standing before a bronze statue of a weeping child. The sculpture's hands were held up to its face, a universal portrait of grief. Julian didn't say anything. He just put his arm around Lily's shoulders, a silent gesture of solidarity. For a long moment, she stared at the statue. The air was still. The only sound was the distant city hum and the frantic beating of Julian's own heart. Then, she turned her head, her face buried in his jacket, and she whispered. Her voice was so quiet, so fragile. It was barely more than a breath of air, a secret meant only for him. "The bad flowers," she breathed. "She makes me clean the bad flowers." The words made no literal sense, yet Julian understood them with perfect, horrifying clarity. It was a code, a child's metaphor for her trauma. It connected to the drawing hidden in his pocket, the drawing of the sad little girl in the field of broken blooms. He held her tighter, his mind racing to decipher the message. He didn't have to wait long for the context. As they were leaving, Catherine bought a ridiculously expensive art book from the gift shop. As the clerk was bagging it, Lily, her eyes wide with a rare spark of interest, reached out a tentative hand to touch a colorful postcard of a Van Gogh painting. A vibrant, swirling explosion of sunflowers. "Don't touch that." Catherine's voice was a whip crack, low and venomous. "Your hands are dirty." Julian looked down. Lily's hands were perfectly clean. But in that moment he finally understood. The bad flowers weren't real. They were the messy, vibrant, joyful creations of a child's imagination. They were her drawings. The ones Catherine deemed imperfect. The ones she forced Lily to scrub away, not from paper, but from her very soul. The call from Marcus came 2 days later. "I have it," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, which in Marcus's language meant the findings were significant. "It's encrypted. The password is your daughter's birthday." Julian felt a chill. He sequestered himself in the guest house and opened the file on his tablet. The report was concise, brutal, and illuminating. It peeled back Catherine's polished veneer to reveal the rot beneath. On the surface, her life was impeccable. But Marcus had dug deeper. He had unsealed a juvenile record from when Catherine was 15. There had been an incident involving her younger sister, who was 6 at the time. The sister had spilled paint on a prized family heirloom, a white silk rug. As punishment, their mother, a woman known for her obsessive-compulsive cleaning, had locked Catherine and her sister in a bathroom for hours, forcing them to scrub the stain with bleach until their hands bled. But Catherine had done something else. She had taken the girls' favorite drawings and destroyed them, shredding them into tiny pieces, calling them filthy and imperfect. It was a direct psychological echo, a trauma being reenacted a generation later. Julian read on, his breath catching in his throat. Catherine's mother had been a tyrant of cleanliness, a woman who equated any form of mess with moral failing. Catherine hadn't just been raised in a clean house. She had been raised in a psychological prison where love was conditional upon perfection. As Julian processed the chilling report, his own great failure replayed in his mind. It wasn't a memory of a business deal gone wrong. It was the memory of the final, ugly fight before the divorce. Catherine had screamed at him, her face distorted with a rage he hadn't understood at the time. "You and your chaos. You come in here with your big ideas and your messy emotions, and you ruin everything." He had dismissed it as hysterics, a lashing out. He hadn't seen it for what it was, the terrified cry of a deeply damaged person who saw his emotional vitality, the very quality that made him a loving father, as a contaminant. He had failed to see her sickness, and in his ignorance, he had left their daughter in the care of a woman who was methodically continuing a cycle of abuse. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had abandoned his post, a soldier leaving his most vulnerable charge on the battlefield. The knowledge didn't absolve him. It hardened his resolve. He now understood his enemy completely, not as a monster of pure evil, but as something more complex and perhaps more dangerous. A victim who had become a perpetrator, projecting her own trauma onto the most helpless person in her life. The final piece he needed fell into place that evening. Catherine, perhaps sensing a shift in the dynamics, her control slipping, was on edge. Julian was playing a quiet game of checkers with Lily on the living room floor. It was the most relaxed he had seen her. She was even on the verge of a small smile when she successfully jumped one of his pieces. In her quiet moment of triumph, she nudged the board with her elbow, and a few of the plastic checkers skittered across the polished hardwood floor. It was nothing, a trifle, but to Catherine it was a grenade. She stormed into the room, her face a mask of fury. "Lily, what have I told you about making messes?" Her voice was sharp, cutting. Before Julian could intervene, she grabbed Lily's arm, her fingers digging into the child's flesh. Lily cried out, a thin, sharp sound of pain. "We do not scatter things. We keep things orderly," Catherine hissed, her composure completely gone. In that moment, she wasn't the elegant socialite. She was the terrified 15-year-old girl in the bathroom, repeating the litany of her own abuser. Julian shot to his feet. "Let her go, Catherine." His voice was deadly quiet, but it cut through her rage like a razor. She dropped Lily's arm as if it were hot, a flicker of fear in her own eyes now. She had made a mistake. She had lost control. And he had seen it. He now had the motive, the means, the history, and a fresh incident. He had all the pieces. His plan, which had been forming in the back of his mind, now solidified. He would not confront her in private. He would not give her a chance to spin a new web of lies. He would force her to shatter her own facade, and he would make sure she had an audience. The charity gala for the Children's Foundation was Catherine's signature social event of the season, a chance for her to perform her role as a benevolent community pillar. This year, Julian insisted it be hosted at her home. He framed it as a peace offering, a gesture of co-parenting goodwill, and sweetened the deal with a 7-figure donation that would be announced at the party. Her ego, as he predicted, was incapable of refusing. She saw it as a victory, a public demonstration of her continued hold over him. She had no idea she was building her own guillotine. Julian personally extended an invitation to one other guest, Mrs. Gable, his quiet ally from next door. He sent a car for her and ensured she was treated as a guest of honor. The night of the party, the house was transformed. Soft lighting glinted off champagne flutes. A string quartet played discreetly in the corner. Catherine was radiant, a queen in her court, accepting compliments on her home, her taste, her generosity. Julian played his part, the supportive ex-husband, a faint, unreadable smile on his lips. He watched her, a predator tracking his prey, waiting for the perfect moment. He found it near the indoor conservatory, where Catherine was holding court by her collection of prize-winning orchids, her perfect, sterile, unmessy flowers. Julian moved through the crowd, a glass of mineral water in his hand, and gently steered her away from her circle of admirers. "The orchids are beautiful, Catherine," he began, his voice calm and conversational. "Everything is perfect tonight, as always." "Thank you, Julian," she said, preening slightly. "I do try to maintain a certain standard." "About standards," he continued, his tone hardening just enough to put her on edge. "I'm still worried about Lily's hands. That eczema seems to be getting worse." Catherine's smile tightened. "The dermatologist has it under control. It's a private matter." "Is it?" Julian took a small step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Because I had my people look into it, and they found some interesting things. They found your mother's medical history, her diagnosis. They found your sealed juvenile record, Catherine." He let the words hang in the air. He saw the color drain from her face. He saw the panic begin to storm in her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her social poise beginning to crack. "The bleach," Julian said, his voice now as cold and hard as steel. "The white silk rug, your little sister, and the drawings you destroyed." He paused, delivering the final, devastating blow. "The bad flowers weren't real, were they, Catherine? They were never real flowers. They were Lily's drawings. The ones you make her scrub away. The ones she makes of a life before you, maybe a life with me. The ones you see as a mess." It was as if he had flipped a switch. The carefully constructed facade of Catherine Thorne shattered into a million pieces. Her face, moments before a mask of serene elegance, contorted into a snarl of pure, undiluted hatred. "You!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly, drawing the attention of the nearest guests. The string quartet faltered. "You have no idea. You with your chaos and your sentiment. She has to learn. The world is ugly and messy, and she has to be clean. She has to be perfect. I'm protecting her. I am a good mother." The torrent of vitriol poured out of her, a confession disguised as an accusation, a public unraveling witnessed by 24 of the city's elite. And then, the most pivotal moment of all. Lily, who had been watching from a nearby doorway, half hidden by a curtain, did something Julian had not seen her do in 2 years. She made a choice. She stepped out of the shadows, walked directly past her screaming mother, and stood beside Julian. She didn't look at him. She looked at Catherine. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to take all the courage in her small body, she reached out and took her father's hand. It was a silent, profound act of defiance. An alignment, a verdict. Mrs. Gable, standing just a few feet away, brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. The other guests stared, frozen in horrified silence. Catherine's tirade faltered as she saw her daughter's small act of rebellion. In that moment, she knew she had lost. Her power, built on fear and control, had evaporated under the chandeliers of her own perfect home. The public implosion was the signal. As Catherine stood, panting and exposed in the horrified silence of her guests, Julian discreetly pressed a button on his phone. It was a prearranged, one-touch call to Marcus, who in turn notified the authorities with a concise summary of the situation, including the presence of multiple witnesses to a confession of child abuse. Within 15 minutes, the quiet hum of the party was replaced by the calm, authoritative presence of 2 police officers and a woman from Child Protective Services. They didn't arrive with sirens blaring. Their entrance was quiet, professional, and utterly disruptive to Catherine's world. The CPS worker, a woman named Ms. Alvarez with kind eyes and a spine of steel, went directly to Julian and Lily, while the officers calmly began taking statements. The dam of fear that had kept the community silent broke. Mrs. Gable, her voice trembling but clear, approached one of the officers. "I need to make a statement," she said, and proceeded to give a tearful, damning account of everything she had seen and heard for the past 2 years. The nightly scrubbing sounds, the absence of play, the day she saw Catherine yank Lily so hard the child nearly fell. Her testimony was a cascade of detail, each one a stone in the wall of evidence now surrounding Catherine. Other guests, who had previously dismissed Catherine's behavior as eccentric perfectionism, now reevaluated every interaction through the lens of her horrifying public confession. They corroborated her unhinged tirade, her admission of punishing Lily, their statements painting a vivid picture of a woman whose mask had not just slipped, but had been violently torn away. Ms. Alvarez knelt down to speak to Lily, her voice gentle. Julian gave his daughter's hand a reassuring squeeze. "It's okay," he whispered. "These people are here to help the police," acting on the information Julian provided through his lawyer, who had also quietly arrived, requested to see the master bathroom. They found the industrial brushes and the harsh, lye-based soap exactly where Julian had said they would be. The discovery was methodical, quiet, and devastatingly final. They bagged the items as evidence, the clinical procedure a stark contrast to the Baroque elegance of the house. The final scene of Catherine's reign was not dramatic. There was no screaming or fighting. She seemed to have collapsed inward, a hollowed-out shell of the woman she had been an hour before. As a female officer gently informed her that she would need to come with them, Catherine simply nodded, her face blank and her eyes empty. She was escorted out through a side door, away from the prying eyes of her former friends. She walked past the pristine orchids, past the perfectly polished floors, leaving her cold, perfect kingdom for the last time. Julian watched her go, not with triumph, but with a profound, weary sadness. Then he turned his attention to the only thing that mattered. He knelt down, scooped Lily into his arms, and held her close. He could feel the slight, fragile tremors running through her body. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the simple, clean scent of a child. "It's over," he whispered into her ear, as much a promise to himself as it was to her. "It's all over. We're going home." The legal system, often a slow and grinding machine, moved with surprising speed. With the weight of Julian's resources, a dozen witness statements, Catherine's public confession, and the physical evidence, emergency custody was granted to Julian without delay. The act of leaving the house was a moment seared into his memory. He carried Lily, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep in his arms, down the grand, curving staircase. He didn't look back. Each step was a step away from a prison, a final, definitive departure from the cold museum of his past life. He strapped her gently into the car seat his staff had installed in the back of his sedan. As he drove away, the limestone facade of the mansion receded in the rearview mirror until it was just another oversized house in a neighborhood of them, its power to intimidate and harm finally broken. Their destination was not one of Julian's many properties, but a neutral, safe space. A sprawling suite in a luxury hotel he owned, a place where new memories could be made. His staff, under Marcus's discreet direction, had transformed it. One of the rooms was now a child's bedroom, filled not with perfectly arranged dolls, but with art supplies, soft blankets, and a mountain of stuffed animals. The first night of freedom was quiet and fragile. Lily woke up once from a nightmare, her body rigid, a silent scream caught in her throat. Julian was there in an instant, lifting her out of bed and holding her in a rocking chair by the window, humming a half-remembered lullaby until her trembling subsided. He held her for hours, watching the city lights glitter below, feeling the immense, terrifying, and profoundly beautiful weight of his new responsibility. This was no longer a weekend visit. This was his life now. This was his mission. Later that night, long after Lily had fallen back into a deep sleep in the big bed beside him, he found her. She was standing on a stool in the vast marble bathroom, trying to reach the soap dispenser. Her small hands were under the running water, and she was beginning to scrub them with a frantic, desperate energy. The old terror resurfaced. Julian's heart broke. He didn't say a word. He just walked over, gently turned off the water, and lifted her off the stool. He wrapped her hands in a soft, warm towel and carried her back to bed. He held her small hands in his own until she fell asleep again, his thumb stroking the scarred, healing skin. He sat in the dark, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, and confronted the depth of his new purpose. All his life, he had been a builder, a conqueror of markets, and a master of complex systems. He thought in terms of strategy, leverage, and outcomes, but none of it had prepared him for this. The fear he felt was more profound than the terror of any market crash. It was the fear of failing this small, wounded person who depended on him for everything. And the hope he felt was purer than any victory he had ever achieved. It was the simple, elemental hope that he could be enough, that he could be the father she deserved. He made a silent vow in the darkness of that hotel room, a promise to the sleeping child beside him. His old life, the life of Julian Thorne the billionaire, was over. That man was a ghost. He was just a father now, and his work was just beginning. 1 year later, the slate-gray sedan was gone, replaced by a dusty SUV with a child's seat in the back. The city penthouse had been sold. They lived in a sprawling, comfortable old farmhouse in the countryside, a place with worn wooden floors and sprawling, messy gardens. The silence of this house was different. It was a living silence, punctuated by the barking of a scruffy terrier puppy named Patches and more frequently, the sound of a child's laughter. Julian found Lily in the backyard, her face smeared with mud, her clothes stained with grass. She was trying to teach Patches how to fetch a stick that was far too big for him, her giggles erupting every time the puppy tumbled over itself in its enthusiastic efforts. Her hands, though still faintly scarred, were the hands of a child again. Grubby from digging in the dirt, sticky from a juice box, strong enough to throw a stick for her dog. Catherine had been committed to a long-term psychiatric facility after being found unfit to stand trial. Julian received terse, clinical updates from her doctors, but he had walled that part of his life off. His focus was singular. His world had shrunk from a global empire to the boundaries of this small farm, and yet, it had never felt so vast or so meaningful. Therapy had given Lily her voice back, first in whispers, then in sentences, and now in a constant stream of questions about bugs and clouds and why dogs wag their tails. Her art covered the refrigerator, a chaotic, vibrant explosion of color. They were messy, imperfect, and the most beautiful things Julian had ever seen. He had a favorite, a drawing of a big, smiling man and a small, smiling girl, holding hands under a lopsided yellow sun. Their hands weren't red. They were the same color as the rest of them. He walked over to her now, a small trowel in his hand. "Ready to plant the new flowers, Lilypad?" She beamed, abandoning the puppy and running to him, taking his hand. Together, they knelt in the rich, dark earth. He opened the flat of pansies, their purple and yellow faces bright in the afternoon sun. He showed her how to loosen the roots, how to dig a small hole, how to gently tuck the plant into its new home. She mimicked him, her small hands surprisingly deft, patting the soil around the flower with a focused, happy expression. He watched her, this resilient, beautiful child who had survived the cold and the dark, and now, finally, was learning to bloom. He looked at her, truly looked at her, no longer as a responsibility or a mission, but as the center of his universe. And in her bright, hopeful eyes, he finally found the absolution he had been searching for. His past failures didn't matter anymore. The empire he built was just money. This right here, this messy, beautiful, ordinary moment was his real legacy. This was his redemption. Sometimes the deepest wounds are hidden in the most pristine places, aren't they? We learn to look for overt signs of danger, for the loud and the violent, but we often overlook the terror that thrives in silence, behind the perfect facade of a well-kept home. What does it say about us that we are so often willing to accept a beautiful lie over a messy truth? It makes one wonder how many silent screams go unheard in the quietest, most orderly of rooms, and what courage it takes for one person to finally stop, to listen, and to dare to ask the simple, terrifying question: what is wrong here? When have you seen a perfect surface and felt, in your gut, the deep cracks running just beneath? Share your stories of when intuition told you that something perfect was perfectly wrong.